right, good evening, everyone. I want to talk about the city of ancient Rome. I'm a Roman historian, and to focus a little bit on the infrastructure of the city, which is something that you don't always hear about. People tend to focus on the big fancy monuments and things. And I'll start, here's an image of what we think ancient Rome looked like. And I'll begin with an amazing fact, which is that ancient Rome had a population of about 1 million inhabitants by the 1st century BC. And this is an unprecedented size for the ancient world. In the ancient world, big cities were usually no larger than 10 or 20,000. Pompeii, for example, one of the most important cities in southern Italy, had a population of around 15,000 at the time it was destroyed by Mount Vesuvius. So Rome was the biggest city yet seen in world history, and in fact, no other city in the Western Hemisphere would reach this size again for 2,000 years, until London hit 1 million people in the 19th century. And as late as 1850, only 2 cities, London and Paris, had populations over 1 million. So ancient Rome was the only true megalopolis before the modern era. Rome was unique, and its unique size led to its having some especially impressive infrastructure. And that's what I want to talk about today. Here's a map of the Roman Empire, and let's begin with the most fundamental of issues, food. How do you feed a city of 1 million people with the technology available in the ancient world? Local resources were nowhere near enough. Even all the food in Italy wouldn't have been enough to feed the city of Rome. So food had to be imported on a gigantic scale. The Romans developed a supply system for the city in which nearly all of the surplus agricultural products of the entire southern half of the Roman Empire was collected and sent to Rome to feed its massive population. And here, all the kind of pink stuff, these are all the regions that basically every scrap of surplus food was collected from and diverted to the city of Rome. So foodstuffs were collected from Egypt, North Africa, Sicily, Spain, put on ships, and sent to Italy. And it's really not too much of an exaggeration to say that half of the Roman Empire existed simply to feed its capital city. And all of this demanded an extensive and elaborate infrastructure of ships, harbors, wharves, quays, barges, warehouses, and distribution centers. As for the food itself, what were the Romans eating? Now, you've probably heard stories of lavish banquets at which Romans stuffed themselves with a vast array of exotic delicacies. And for the very wealthiest Romans, there is some truth to this. We do have surviving Roman cookbooks with recipes for things like pies stuffed with peacock tongues. But that's true. But think of this as the Roman 1%, maybe the 1/10 of 1%. And the overwhelming majority of Romans had to make do with much simpler fare. In fact, there were just 3 basic foodstuffs that formed the majority of the average Roman's diet. And these are so characteristic of ancient Mediterranean civilizations that historians label them the Mediterranean triad. And the statistic you usually hear thrown around is that for about 80% of Rome's populace, just these 3 foods accounted for about 80% of their daily caloric intake. Now, with that much hint, you want to guess what the 3 foods were?
Fish.
What do you think Mediterranean people would eat? Fish is probably number 4, but fish goes bad quickly. It's hard to preserve. That wasn't one of the big 3. Olives. Olives are the quintessential crop of the Mediterranean. And how do you eat your olives? In what form? Oil, right? You press them, you turn it into oil. You can preserve that for a long time. What else do Romans eat? Figs, wine, actually grapes. Yes, grapes turned into wine. And what's the most basic foodstuff? Grain, wheat. So that's your Mediterranean triad. Olives, grapes turned into wine, and wheat turned into usually either bread or a kind of porridge or gruel. All right, these 3 staples are what most Romans had: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And a typical meal would have been a hunk of bread dipped in some olive oil, washed down with a cup of wine. And to the Romans, this triad of food is what civilized peoples ate. Now, to support the city, scholars have calculated that each year a minimum of 600,000 tons of these 3 basic foodstuffs had to be imported to Rome from overseas provinces. This was done during the summer, stored in warehouses that distributed throughout the year. And just to give you some idea of the scale of all this, these warehouses, here's a reconstruction one, were known as Horia. They clustered in one region of Rome near the Tiber River, and the largest of them could contain up to 150 separate storage rooms covering 200,000 square feet with a capacity of 25,000 tons of wheat. And just to try and give you some sense how massive the scale we're talking about here, consider this. This is one of the hills of Rome called Monte Testaccio. But this hill is not a natural topographic feature. It's actually an artificial mountain entirely made up of broken remains of ancient North African and Spanish clay olive oil containers. And here's a picture of the top, and you can see this is what the whole thing is. So as these pots were emptied out at the main warehouses, the Romans tossed them out, and over about 300 years, this garbage heap of discarded olive oil pots created a mountain a quarter of a mile long and 500 feet high. Monte Testaccio means Mount Pottery, by the way. All right, that's food. How about drink? Well, here too Rome was exceptional for getting its water supply not as is usual from wells or a local river, but instead was supplied by a system of aqueducts that brought water from springs in the hills to the city. Just a few stats. By the 4th century AD, Rome had 19 aqueducts, which collectively were bringing 250 million gallons of fresh water per day to the city. This bounty was distributed to the populace through a complex network of pipes and tanks, which delivered the water to 1,500 public fountains and pools and about 900 private and public baths. The Roman water supply system was a continual flow system, and this means that water passed through it continuously whether people were using the fountains or the basins or not. And the whole thing operated by gravity, so there's almost no pumps involved in this. So the elevation of the water and the aqueducts was of vital importance, and the whole thing had to be very carefully graded. The average gradient in the Roman aqueduct system is about a 15-foot drop per mile of distance. So that's about how they calculated it. At strategic points along the aqueducts, the water would enter large tanks or reservoirs, and the function of these was to stop the flow of the water so that sediment being carried in the water would be separated out. And water would go through a sequence of these settling tanks, and so by the time it reached consumers, hopefully it would be fairly free of contaminants. About 1/3 of the aqueduct water was actually consumed outside the city for irrigation on farms. Roughly another third went to public fountains and baths, and of the remainder, a substantial portion was used by the emperor, including the supply to the imperial baths. Now, one of the greatest challenges faced by those charged with maintaining this system was a problem that private individuals would often illegally tap into the aqueducts. So people would bore holes into the aqueduct and then attach their own pipes to bring water into their houses or businesses. And this was such a problem that the government maintained a gang of slaves constantly patrolling all the exposed sections, cutting off the illegal taps and fixing the holes. The Roman aqueduct system was a truly impressive achievement, and it was one that even the ancients marveled at. One Roman water engineer named Frontinus proudly stated, "How can you compare such an array of indispensable structures carrying so much water with the idol pyramids of the Egyptians, or the useless though famous works of the Greeks?" To carry all this water away, Rome also had an impressive network of sewers. And the very first public work built in the city of Rome was a sewer, which was dug to drain the previously swampy region of the Roman Forum to simply make it habitable. This sewer, known as the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain, eventually developed into this you see here. It's a buried channel made of high-quality stone and concrete, 12 feet high and 10 feet wide. The outlet of the Cloaca Maxima, which you see here, into the Tiber River, can still be seen, and it's one of the oldest monuments in the city. So if you want to see one of the oldest bits of Rome, you have to crawl down by the river and see this. You'll notice there's a homeless guy living on top of it. So this thing is getting reused in various ways. All right, for a long time, Rome lacked a really good harbor. And this was rectified during the early empire when the Emperor Claudius excavated a massive new harbor, 4,000 feet in width, out of the Italian coastline. And this enormous basin was connected to the Tiber by a series of canals. It was called portus, which not very creatively means the port. And it was equipped with breakwaters, warehouses, and a huge lighthouse. A few decades later, the Emperor Trajan rebuilt Portus and added a hexagonal inner harbor where ships would be completely safe from any storm. And by the way, if you're ever flying into Rome's airport today, the modern airport is partially built on top of the ruins of the Roman Portus. And that hexagonal harbor still exists, and if you land at the right runway and look out your window, you'll see that hexagonal basin still in the ground there as you land. The Romans were able to build such impressive harbors and various sort of works around the rivers because they developed a special kind of concrete that could be poured directly into wooden molds underwater, and it would harden there despite being immersed. This Roman hydraulic cement used a volcanic sand called pozzolana as one of its components, and it was used for aqueducts and sewers and other stuff. And exhaustive technical analysis of the composition of this has revealed that Roman cement was more effective and more durable than its modern equivalents. One of the most common expressions you hear about Rome is that all roads lead to Rome. And there's a lot of truth to this. The Romans were master road builders, and one of the first things they did upon capturing or conquering a new area was to lay down a series of roads, marking that region as belonging to them. And I always think of the metaphor here that the Romans are almost like an animal who likes to mark its territory. But in this case, how the Romans mark things is by putting roads all over them. The main Roman roads were marvels of practical engineering. They would have a deep and solid foundation excavated out. Then gravel and sand provide a base, and finally you'd have a top layer of paving stones. Major roads were usually at least 15 feet in width, and they were built with a crown so that rainwater would flow off to the sides and go into drainage ditches. The Romans also prided themselves on making their roads straight and level. So no matter what the terrain was, even if there was a mountain in the way, they would drill a tunnel through it. If there was a river or valley, they would put a bridge over it. So Roman roads like to go straight. Speaking of bridges, as a measure of the quality of Roman bridge construction, there are at least 350 Roman bridges which still exist today, here's one of them, and are still in use. Many of them bearing modern heavy wheeled traffic, which obviously they weren't even designed for. And just as today roads are marked with mile markers, the Romans placed stones at 1 mile intervals along their roads, which bore inscriptions declaring the distance measured in miles from the capital city. The total length of the Roman road network, both small and large roads, has been estimated at about 50,000 miles. And by the height of the Roman Empire, you could travel every step of the way from Spain to Jerusalem on well-crafted Roman paving. What about housing? Where did the inhabitants of Rome live? Well, in Rome and in other cities, only again a tiny percentage of Romans actually could afford to live in a house. So where did most people live? They lived in these high-rise apartment buildings. The Romans called these islands, or insulae in Latin, because of the way they sometimes occupied an entire city block. And insulae were located all over the city of Rome, and some of the larger ones could have up to 10 stories. We have a document that survives from the 4th century AD that has the interesting statistic that at that time, there were fewer than 2,000 private homes in the city of Rome. But there were over 46,000 insulae. This is all the more amazing when you consider that each home would have only housed one family, but an insulae could shelter hundreds. Emperors repeatedly set limits on the height of insulae, apparently out of concern that they were being built too high with shabby materials, resulting in fatal collapses. And those limits in the legal documents are usually around 60 or 70 feet. So that's equivalent to 8 or 9 stories. And the fact that it was necessary to set those limits suggests that they were routinely being exceeded. So Rome was a high-rise megalopolis. The Roman poet Martial mentions one wretched inhabitant of an insulae, who had to trudge up 200 stairs to reach his squalid apartment in the attic. Apartment dwellers were in the habit also of throwing their garbage out the window, and this included not only things like bones, broken pots, and food remnants, but sewage as well. For the overwhelming majority of people, the toilet consisted of a pot in the corner of your apartment, and despite laws against this, very clearly full pots were routinely dumped out the window. Look at the detail here, you'll see this. So frequent was this practice that one of the leading cause of lawsuits in ancient Rome was one person suing another person for having dropped something on their head while they were walking down the street. And if you look at these law cases, the single most common item mentioned in the lawsuits is human excrement. Let's shift from sewers to something more pleasant, spectacles. The inhabitants of ancient Rome were able to attend some of the most amazing public entertainments of all time, and these spectacles demanded some truly spectacular buildings. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Colosseum, more correctly known as the Flavian Amphitheater. This is where gladiator games were held, but gladiator games were rare events. They were routinely only held twice a year, and the Colosseum only sat about 55,000 people. That's impressive, but again, that's mostly the upper class. So where did ordinary Romans go for their entertainment? Well, the answer is they would go here, the Circus Maximus, to watch chariot racing. And chariot racing was by far the most frequent and popular form of entertainment for the average Roman. Chariot races were held on over 100 days each year. And this stadium could seat 250,000 spectators, and it's made of marble. So imagine a stadium, third of a mile long, 250,000 people. That's an impressive stadium. It had an oval track, as you can see. In the middle was a spine. There were these triple posts called metae, which are the turning posts, and some decoration. And there were organizations known as factions, which trained, equipped, and entered teams in the races. And the factions were called the Reds, the Whites, the Blues, and the Greens. And think of these exactly like modern professional sports teams. So they would have farms, they would train horses, they would enter chariots. And a typical race would have 12 chariots with each team or faction entering 3. Now, modern tracks are arranged with gradual curves for safety. Notice the turns here. When you turn around the metae, it's a 180-degree turn and all the chariots bunch up. So this stadium is designed to maximize crashes. Also, fans were truly fanatical fans. People would pick a faction, they would dress in the colors, they would go to the circus, they would chant, they would get into riots or fights with fans of the other team. And if you think people are fanatical fans of Green Bay, I'll tell you one anecdote. When one of the most successful charioteers of the white faction died in a crash and was cremated in an elaborate public ceremony, one distraught fan who couldn't live without his hero flung himself onto the funeral pyre and died with him. All right, I began with food and I'll end with food. Just as the Romans defined civilized people as those who ate the Mediterranean triad of olive, grain, and wine, they also defined people whom they regarded as barbarians by what they ate. And in particular, they defined the northern barbarians of Europe as cultures whose diet was based around its own special triad of foods. So, what do you think barbarians ate? Take a guess. Red meat and? What else do you get from animals that produce meat? Cheese, and what do you drink if you're a barbarian? Beer. So, red meat, cheese, and beer. So, I have no doubt that if a Roman were somehow transported in a time machine to modern Wisconsin, he would take one look around, meat, cheese, beer, and say, I know who you guys are, you're barbarians. Thank you. I'm a barbarian. Questions for Greg?
I'm not going to give you a question, but I hated history in school, and I found you so very interesting, so thank you.
I have bad teachers. History is is a story with characters and a plot. And if you tell it as a story, it's interesting. So it's not just a bunch of names and dates, it's much more than that.
With such a well-developed economy, how did it function? Did they have barter, currency, slavery? Like, tell us about that.
I mean, this is a big debate among historians, is how much of the economy was an actual kind of, you would say, almost capitalistic economy, because the state controlled so much of it. So the state is subsidizing ships to bring grain to Rome and things like that. So there's this huge segment of the economy which is really subsidized by the state. And then to the side of it, you have kind of the true economy of people buying and selling things. So there's a lot of discussion about this. I mean, the Romans did have coins, so they had money, they had a cash-based economy, they had credit, they had lending, they had all those things. So it was fairly sophisticated, but it's hard to sort of evaluate because so much of it was tied up with other things. And the Romans had this odd way of giving a lot of stuff to the people. So it's this system of where things like food or entertainment were provided to the people in return for political favor of certain groups. So politicians, their goal wasn't to get rich, it was to build a big fancy aqueduct because then you'll get elected to office and that's what you really wanted. So money isn't at the root of things for the Romans, it's status. And that's very important to understanding how they view economic transactions, because for them it's all about what status do I get by spending money? Accumulating money isn't a goal in and of itself. So, answer. Yeah.
Greg, can you talk a little bit about the extent to which what the Romans did with respect to infrastructure continues to influence sort of what we see with modern cities?
It's a huge influence. I mean, urban planning today goes straight back to the Romans. In fact, an inordinate number of particularly cities in Europe, which all have a grid plan, started out as Roman legionary camps because they would always lay out the camps on this grid plan. So, I mean, in things like sanitation and sewers and water supply, road building, all of this very much we're looking to the Romans. And sometimes people say that the Roman Empire took up the concrete revolution that occurred under the Romans. So they didn't invent concrete, but they applied it in much wider contexts, and they had all these different fun types of concrete, and that's really the secret behind a lot of the buildings. So when you think of a Roman building, you think of it as being marble. That marble is just a decorative veneer. Almost certainly the core of the building is brick or concrete. So they were very good at building stuff, and the stuff they built lasts. I mean, look around. How many of the buildings that we build today do you think are going to be here in 2,000 years? But the Roman stuff still is, and that's impressive.
So my question is about sanitation. They had the foresight to build, waterways, but I mean, I have to imagine if people were dumping human waste out on the streets, and there was human waste flowing in the streets. So, I mean, how were there not plagues?
There were. The Romans had no understanding of the germ sort of theory of disease, so they just don't get that dumping all the sewage in the street is bad. And because of that, mortality rates are horrific from disease. In fact, cities where you have all those people crammed together are death traps. So historians have estimated that if you were just to shut the gates of the city of Rome and not let anyone else immigrate in about 15 years they'd all be dead. So cities are unhealthy. And infant mortality is horrific. I mean, one of the biggest differences, I think, between our world and the ancient Roman world is that about 1/3 of babies died in their first year of life. And that just changes all kinds of things. If you're a woman in the Roman world and you make it to puberty, which is remarkable in and of itself, you have to successfully give birth 6 times just to keep the population from dying out. So these kind of grim statistics mean that they really didn't understand disease, and it's a huge problem, absolutely. Yeah.
So could you kind of nutshell the population for the last 2,000 years of Rome? How has it shifted, the plague?
Well, okay, Rome was a small city, it was a mud hut for a long time, then Rome became the start of an empire, expanded to about 100,000. And then all of a sudden, in the late Republic, Rome conquered the entire Mediterranean, all sorts of complicated things happened, and they swelled the population of Rome, and it just went crazy to about 1 million. And it stayed at about 1 million for 3 centuries, let's say. And then once the Roman Empire collapses and all that food is no longer being collected, the population of Rome just plummets, and by the 700s or so, it's back down to about 20,000. So it's this huge ruin with just a few people kind of scattered around. And then it slowly increases afterwards. But that's why the ancient Rome is such an aberration. And it took that entire empire, I mean, an empire that spanned 3 continents, to sustain this very artificial construct, which was the city of Rome. So it's truly anomalous. But it's also interesting because it's the closest analogy to a modern city and to all the kind of problems that a modern city has that we can look at in history of this era. So that's one of the things that fascinates me about it.